Welcome back to my Strapi series. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Strapi Users and Permissions plugin, which allows you to gate your content types and your content in Strapi with a JWT token authentication with multiple providers. We'll focus on the registration and login workflows, which are the most frequently implemented, of course, and I will also show you how to implement a simple user interface using Next.js, integrating with this users and permissions plugin in Strapi. I will start with a relatively empty Strapi instance. As always, a GitHub repository will be linked in the video description. When you clone that repository, you will see something like this. You'll have the Strapi CMS folder, which will include this Strapi instance and the database. I'll give you the credentials in a README file for the admin user. And of course, you will have the Next.js UI folder because we'll actually build a user interface with Next.js for login and registration to integrate with this Strapi CMS. Once you clone and run the Strapi instance, it will look something like this. It's relatively empty. What you have are the products content type, which I've made and added 3 products. These products just have a title. I will only use them for demonstrative purposes in order to have some content type. Besides that, we can open the plugins section and see that we have the roles and permissions plugin. It's included in the base installation of Strapi. As it mentions here in the description, the plugin allows you to implement full authentication based on JWT and basically gate your content types and your API content with a JWT based authentication. To access the plugin settings, we go to settings and we have a whole section for the users and permissions plugin. You'll notice that sometimes the plugin is called roles and permissions, sometimes users and permissions. These are interchangeable. That's not that vital. Here we have first the roles. By default, we get 2 included roles, authenticated and public. As I've probably mentioned multiple times in the previous videos, public is a role that is publicly accessible. If you don't authenticate, you fall into the public role. So basically, if you allow content types here to be, for example, retrieved, created, deleted, they will be publicly deletable, retrievable, accessible, even without a token authentication. Authenticated is the only included default role for an authenticated user, and as mentioned, it's given by default to any authenticated user. So you can create more roles here, of course, call them whatever you like, give them specific granular permissions for each of your content types. And in fact, you're encouraged to do so. You can create granular roles for each content type and give your user multiple roles. Now, next up, we'll go to providers. This users and permissions plugin does not just work with local users with email authentication, although this is the default enabled mode and the default enabled provider of basically user credentials. You can also integrate it with Facebook, Discord, GitHub, many different authentication providers. In this video, I'll focus exclusively on the default email provider. The users are, of course, a content type that is included by default. They have these fields: username, email, provider, which will of course be a text field indicating the provider, password. You have a couple of tokens, a boolean if the user is confirmed, blocked, and the roles. By default, you have no users here, and the users table is empty. Let's go back to the settings. We have email templates here, because the users and permissions plugin also allows you to implement easily. In fact, it's already implemented. You can just use it. A reset password workflow or email address confirmation of your registered users. And here you have email templates, which are easily modifiable. They use this template string literal, which you can use to create your custom emails. Besides that, the most important section actually is the advanced settings, the last one. Here you can select the default role for authenticated users. So basically, when a user is authenticated, he'll fall into this role. Also, you have the option to limit the users to 1 account per email address. This is not going to allow users to register with the email provider with the same email, because that would make them basically impossible to authenticate, this will disallow users to create multiple accounts, as it says, using different out providers. So for example, a user won't be able to create an account with the email provider using the same email address and then, for example, authenticate with Google, where his Google provider account has this same address. By default, it's a good practice to keep this to true in order to have exclusive uniqueness between your user accounts without worrying about authentication providers and limiting the uniqueness only to the authentication provider. We have the option to enable or disable signups. If you turn this to off, the registration will be completely disabled. You won't be able to register a user anyhow. We'll see in a bit, the user registration by default happens with the RESTful API, for example, with a simple post request. You have the reset password URL. Because Strapi is headless, basically the actual user interface for resetting your password will be somewhere hosted on a different platform, site, whatever. It will have its own URL, and basically this URL will be passed in the email template for reset password right here. And Strapi will also send as a URL parameter the token for resetting the actual password. Besides that, we can enable email confirmation. This will force the user to confirm his email before his account becomes confirmed and usable, in order to make sure that the email is valid. By default, this is off. And if you enable email confirmation, of course you have to add the redirection URL, which will lead the user to which the user, basically the URL the user will click in the email to confirm his email right here. And of course, that is also included in the email. That's how it's used. It's URL, and you get the confirmation code passed as a URL parameter by Strapi. And these are the settings for the users and permissions plugin. So by default, we can create users, of course, from the Strapi admin panel. Because users is just a content collection type, we can just create a new entry here. And that is one of the ways to create a user account. The other method is to use the RESTful API. I'll start Postman right now, and we will create a user account. Okay, so I have some requests here. This is actually the request we're interested in. We'll be making a post request. The API is right now on my local PC as I'm in development mode. Then we will go to the API route, auth, local, and register. This is the endpoint you need to ping API auth local register with a post request in order to create a new user account. You don't need to set authentication tokens, of course, you don't have any. The only thing you need to set is a raw JSON user details object, which has to include a username, email, and password. And I've already prefilled this with some basic sample details. And if I send this request now, I get a response. And the response is that my user registration is successful. So in the root, I get two objects, JWT, which is the JSON web token. I can immediately get this token and use it for authentication. So basically, at this stage, I can say to my user on the front end, you're registered, and I can log you in successfully and redirect them, for example, to a gated page. Because you have this token and you can use it in your HTTP request to Strapi to authenticate him. And we have the user object. This is the newly created user with all of his details. If I check Strapi now and refresh the user's collection type, I have my new user. It's confirmed, it has a row of authenticated, and everything is working as expected so far. Now, if I ping this endpoint, for example, with the same details, I'll get an error. And let's see how that looks. I get a no data object and an error object with a status code, name, and a message, which indicates what the error is. The good thing is this message is specific enough and user-friendly enough to just show in the user interface. In this case, the email or username are already taken. All right, now we have our user. In order to actually log in, we can send a request to API auth local without register. And this time, we don't need username or email, we need an identifier. And this property can be both For example, if I enter my username of this newly created user, I logged in successfully. If I enter the email, I also log in successfully. In case I enter wrong credentials, for example, a wrong password, I again get an error object and data is null. And the error is specific enough to tell me that I have an invalid identifier or password. In fact, a more specific error would be a security risk for a login system. You usually don't want to tell the user, yeah, password specifically is incorrect, because that is basically easing the brute force process if someone wants to hack you. Besides that, we can log in and we can register. If I log in, I can use the JWT to authenticate now. Let's take a look at how that would work. I just logged in, I sent a post request to API auth local with my ID and password, and I have my JSON web token, which I can use in my next HTTP requests as the authorization header. It will be bearer token, like this, basically. Here in Postman, I have a user interface. In reality, I'll show you how that looks in the row headers right here when we send the request. Now we need to send some request that is gated. That's why I have this products collection type with a title, and we have 3 products here. So this collection type, if I go to rows authenticated, I will allow the authenticated user to do everything with it. And I will disallow the public user to do whatever. It's like that by default. If I send this request without authentication, I'll copy my token. API products. I get a 403 forbidden status, which is expected. I'm not authenticated. I shouldn't have access to this data type. If I paste my token as the authorization bearer header, I can send the same request. And let me see, request body. Oh, I'm making a post request. I need to make a get request here. I'm trying to retrieve products. And I get my data. Here we go. Laptop, smartphone, book, just my 3 products. But the important thing is I was able to actually authenticate. And here is my authorization header. This is basically how you would define it in a row HTTP request. The header will be authorization, and then it will say a string. Its value will be a string with the value of bearer, then a white space, an empty space string, and the token. That's very standard practice for authentication with JWT. And this is how we authenticate after we've logged in. Now, as a next step, I will show you how to implement an actual user interface for login and registration using these endpoints. You can probably figure out how to do that by now, but I just want to demonstrate a simple use case with Next.js. So this Next.js user interface will be included in the repository linked in the description, so you can just clone it and play with it. But I will show you right now how it works. And I'll go through the actual code. It's fairly simple. So this Next.js app just has a home view which just says home. The actual views are registration and login. Here are both. Let's look at the code for them. And basically, as I mentioned, the page has just some home, very basic global styles, just to style the form elements, nothing special. We don't care about styles at this stage. Let's look at registration first. It's a fairly simple client component in Next.js. I'll talk about the message state variable later. We return a form that has 3 fields and labels for them: username, which is of type text, email, and password. These fields, I recommend to name them, meaning name exactly as you would send them to the API, if you don't have a very specific reason not to. Then we have a submit button and an empty div, not an empty div, but a div that shows this message state variable. I will use this message state variable to show error messages, success messages, just an indication to the user for the result of the form. This is the simplest way you can implement this. I want to show you the most basic case and you can build up from here. This form has the following behavior. On submit, the event is this register function. Let's expand this function now. It's quite straightforward, although it looks a little bit long. It's not really. It's an async function and it takes the event because it's an event handler that basically it fires on the submit event. It prevents the default behavior because on submit the form would redirect to the action URL. Then we set message to now, basically the error or status message that is shown below the form. This is because we want to reset that message on each request, on each login attempt or form submission. Then we take the form data from the event target, which is the form basically, and the form data would be these three fields: email, password, and username. Then we convert that form data to JSON. This would just make the form data object to a JSON object, which is exactly what our API expects to receive. And then we make an HTTP request using the fetch API. I've hard-coded the URL. In a production application, you wouldn't do that. You would have some kind of a provider function which returns your endpoint, or a config file with endpoints for different APIs, which would also contain your strapi endpoint. But this is for educational purposes, and for the sake of simplicity and understandability, we ping our API locally to API auth local register. Just as we did with Postman, we make the same request, just with code. And the options are the following: method post, headers. We need to set the content type of the request to application JSON because we're sending and expecting back JSON. And finally, the request body, which is the stringified JSON data. And then we get the response from that request, which we parse to JSON. Finally, we check if the response has an error. As I showed you in Postman, if the request is unsuccessful, there will be an error object which will contain a message. In that case, I set the message state variable to the error message and it will just show up to the user. Otherwise, I set the message to successful registration if we get the JWT and user objects. So let's see how that works in reality. I go to the registration endpoint. I'll just enter some user details, the same user details, so that we get an error that this user already exists. If I press submit now, I get an error. Email or username are already taken. Basically what happened is we went through this, the form data converted to JSON, the request was sent, and we got a response error object with that message, and the state variable was set to the error message. If I change my username to something else and submit again, I have a successful registration this time because I passed through the entire process, the user was created successfully, and I set this message manually. If I go now to Strapi and check my content manager, go to the users collection, I have my new user. And it's exactly as I want it. Now let's go to the login view. It's almost the same in terms of function. In fact, I haven't even renamed it because I copy-pasted the registration component and modified it. In a real application, you would attempt to reuse as much as possible between the two components. Again, this is for quality and education, not necessarily the best code for production, although it's not that bad, to be honest. So we again have a form which on submit post this register. It shouldn't be register, this event handler, it should be login. And we have two fields: identifier, which the label for is username or email, and password, which is a field of type password. And then submit again the message div beneath it. We make the same event handler, prevent default, set the message to no, parse the form data, and the request is again a post request with application JSON, and the body is the form body. The request is to the API out local endpoint this time because we want to log in, and we pass the request options. Of course, we get the response and the same behavior for error handling or success handling. If there's an error, show the message. Otherwise, show a textual message indicating to the user that the operation completed successfully. And if we test this view now. I can use the new user. Let's say I make a mistake in the password. I'll get an error message by Strapi. If I don't make a mistake in the password, I'll get a message that the login was successful. Here at this stage, I also receive the JSON Web Token in the response. And I can set it to the user's local storage, for example, or as a cookie in order to implement persistent authentication between views. That's basically how you implement a user interface for the Strapi users and roles plugin specifically for the registration and login workflows. With that, I'll wrap today's video. If you like the content, don't forget to subscribe to get notified when the next video in the series is released. Take care.